Okay, I'm happy to welcome you here to today's meeting of the NSF Working Group, where we're going to be talking about current and pending, sometimes called other support forms. And whether you're here for NSF or something else, we're excited to have you. There's been a lot of changes, both here locally and in the federal regulation landscape and how these are handled. And so we're going to be talking about some of that as we go through today's talk. So, current and pending other support forms. Okay, so it's helpful to understand why these have become a thing in the last few years. So what are they looking for on these forms? Okay, so there are a few things. They're looking to prevent scientific and budgetary overlap. So basically, you can't get funded twice for doing the same work. You can't go to the NSF and say, please fund me, and then turn around and go to the NIH and say, will you please fund me as well, and double dip. Be nice, but that's not allowed. So when they look at the current pending and other support, they're looking at does this overlap with something else? And there have been cases where that I'm aware of where different agencies have talked to each other and kind of said, we think this overlaps. Are you funding it? Should we fund it? You know, no guarantee that that will happen there. The other thing that they want to make sure is that you have sufficient capacity for completing the project. We all know that person that takes on way too much and never actually gets anything done, so they don't want to fund you if they think that that's going to happen. So they're looking at how much effort, how much time have you already promised to other projects, so that they know how much is left that you can spend on this project. And then the third one that is where most of the regulatory changes have been coming from has to do with research security, where they are using these current and pending other support forms to try to determine if there is a security risk in funding you particularly or another member of your team to do this work, okay? And so one of the main things that they're looking for here are these malign foreign talent recruitment programs, okay? And participation in a malign foreign talent recruitment program means that you're ineligible for federal research funding, okay? And part of why these have become a thing is that under President Biden, National Security Presidential Memo 33 came out, which required some sort of current pending other support form for all federal research and development grants, or maybe just research grants, but federal research grants. So you would think, since they're under the same regulation, each agency, they would get together and do one form. Not quite. So generally, the agencies have slightly different procedures, slightly different forms. So when it comes to specifics, I'm going to talk about the NSF today. Most of them follow something pretty similar. Okay. So speaking of that, NSF, NIH, and a few others. It's not just these two. These are the two big ones. But like USDA, I believe, Department of Energy, they use SciENcv to complete these forms. Okay, and so we'll do a little bit of how to actually complete those forms. I'll open up SciENcv and show you some how to later, and we'll see all the agencies that use that. But before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how to do it, first I want to go over what you need to disclose and also some of our procedures here on campus as the regulations have changed. Okay, so the NSF has a page on the NSPM 33 disclosures, and that is very useful. I'll show it to you a little bit later. I just want to flag that right now the NSF is currently basically just following NSPM 33. Some agencies have additional requirements. Okay, so at the heart of all of this, coming straight from the NSPM 33 language is here. You must disclose on current pending other support all resources made available or expected to be made available to an individual in support of the individual's research and development efforts, regardless of whether the source is foreign or domestic, whether the resource is made available to the entity applying for the Research and Development Award, that would be JMU for everyone here, or directly to the individual. So that means if you personally win some sort of award and it goes into your checking account, if it's going to support your research and development efforts, then it does have to be disclosed. If you get some sort of grant and it's paid to JMU, but that money is still going to your research and development efforts, that has to be disclosed. And I say money, but the third bullet point here says it has to be disclosed whether or not the resource has monetary value. The second point that comes straight from the NSPM 33 memo is it has to be disclosed in-kind contributions requiring a commitment of time and directly supporting the individual's research and development efforts, such as providing some sort of office or laboratory space, some sort of equipment, supplies, employees, or students. So if Merck or some other company is funding some students to work on your project, even though there's no money coming to you, that still needs to be disclosed. So those are kind of the overarching, and it's often a little bit confusing how that interfaces with kind of real-world examples. So the following are from the NSF guidance of where it needs to be disclosed and where, because something that we'll see is there are things that need to be disclosed, but the NSF has decided that you should disclose them somewhere else. Okay, so fleshing out that in-kind contribution, if you look at that NSF page where they say disclosures, they have 3 bullet points for what needs to be disclosed on current and pending other support. Okay, so first of all, it needs to have an estimated dollar value of $5,000 or more. It has to have an associated time commitment, so where you are required to spend some sort of time using that in-kind contribution. So, if someone's providing students, there's probably an expectation that you'll provide some mentorship, and that takes time. And the key thing that often throws people for a loop is that it has to be not intended for use on the project or proposal that you are currently proposing. Okay, and that sometimes throws people for a loop. And so I just want to say, if it is intended for use on the project or proposal being proposed, so someone has funded a student to work specifically on this project, then that actually still has to be disclosed. It just gets disclosed on facilities, equipment, and other resources. Okay, and I know this is very confusing how it combines with the first thing that I read, that very broad general statement of stuff that has to be disclosed on current pending other support. If you have any questions, do reach out to a program officer. It's always their opinion that matters. Okay, something else that frequently comes up is about consulting activities. They do need to be disclosed in these conditions where it requires research as part of the consulting activity. So if you are a consultant for something that has no research component, then you do not have to disclose it generally, unless, see point number 2. Even if it doesn't involve performing research, but it's connected to your research portfolio and can impact funding, alter time or effort commitments, or impact scientific integrity. So maybe your consultant isn't providing research, but you are providing some sort of service to some sort of company that is a major mover in, say, I don't know, quantum computing, okay? And so that has the ability to impact scientific integrity. You might be using their resources in a way that is not ethical, or purchasing theirs over something else, or impacting the funding. The big thing where this comes in is about time or effort commitments. So general rule of thumb is if your consulting activity is in some way connected to JMU, or you're adjusting your JMU contract formally to account for it, that is altering time or effort commitments in a way that needs to be disclosed. Even if that's not happening, you may still need to disclose it. Okay. And the other case, whether or not it is research, whether or not the second one provides, if it requires you to conceal or withhold confidential financial or other ties in the entity, okay, it has to be disclosed. So for example, if as part of your consultancy agreement you have some sort of non-disclosure clause in there, then it has to be disclosed. And that's true regardless of the duration of the engagement. So even if it's a 2-week consultancy, it has to be disclosed. If it has some sort of requirement of concealing or withholding confidential financial or other information ties. Okay, so what are some other things that you need to disclose? Okay, postdocs, students, visiting scholars who are supported by some sort of external entity. Again, they go on CPOS if they are intended for use on some other project and there's a time commitment associated with them. If someone else is mentoring them, but they're just sitting in your lab and you don't really interact with them, I suppose they probably don't need to be disclosed, although you might want to check with the program officer. Okay. Again, this sometimes throws people for a loop, because what if they are working on the project that you are proposing? You still have to disclose them. They just go on facilities, equipment, other resources. It's a little bit weird to call a person some sort of piece of equipment. Maybe they count an other resource, I don't know. But that's where they go. If you have travel supported or paid for by an external entity to perform research activities with associated time commitment. So examples here might be some sort of fellowship or some sort of partnership where you go to, say, another laboratory for 1 month. They're going to pay salary, or maybe not pay salary, just the travel. But there's a time commitment. You have to be there. So we see that with fellowships. Startup company, if you own or partially own or are involved with a startup company that is based on non-organization licensed IP. Okay, so we'll see a little bit more in the exceptions what that non-organization licensed IP is, but basically if you have some intellectual property and there's a startup company working on commercializing it, unless that intellectual property is owned by JMU and licensed to that company by JMU, it has to be disclosed. And then any sort of startup packages, unless they're from JMU. So as new faculty, JMU generally provides you with some sort of startup funds. And as we'll see, those don't have to be disclosed for the NSF. But if you have some sort of commercial, industrial, or other support that is providing some startup funds to your lab, that does need to be disclosed. So maybe you have an NIH grant, an R00 or something that is providing some startup funds. You need to disclose that. Okay. The one thing that I want to highlight as something that absolutely needs to be disclosed, although the guidance is a little bit fluffy around it, is any sort of participation in anything connected with foreign government sponsors. So current and pending participation in or applications to programs sponsored by foreign governments, instrumentalities, or entities. Okay, so if it is a UK company, it definitely has to be disclosed. Okay, so even if it's not the government, if it's just some sort of foreign company, still disclose it somewhere. Okay. And this includes most definitely foreign government-sponsored talent recruitment programs. Okay. Now, it does have to be disclosed somewhere. Okay. The NSF says depending on the type of contract, it could belong in CPOS, BioSketch, or in the facilities, equipment, other resources. So I'm going to give some rules of thumb for where it goes, but please check specific regulations. If there's any questions, talk to your program officer. If it is some sort of appointment, some sort of like visiting scholar or affiliated scholar or something like that, it should probably be on your BioSketch. Okay. If it is providing some sort of research support to you, then it should probably be on CPOS or the facilities, equipment, or other resources. It goes on CPOS, that's abbreviation for current, pending, other support, if it is not intended for use on this project. It goes on facilities, equipment, and other resources if it is intended for use on this project. That's a general rule of thumb. Again, if you have questions, you should talk to your program officer. As I mentioned, there are other types of support. I didn't go through the whole list here because I'll show you the NSF page later on in this training that have to be disclosed on facilities, equipment, and other resources. So just because I didn't mention it here doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be disclosed. Okay. But what are some things that the NSF says don't need to be disclosed? Again, if you're preparing something for another agency, they might have different guidance. Okay. If the support is over, if it's ended, they're no longer supporting you, you do not have to disclose it, whether that was last week or 10 years ago. If it is being paid by an external entity to attend a conference or workshop, so let's say you are presenting at University of wherever and they are paying for your travel, you don't need to disclose that. Teaching commitments. The NSF knows faculty members have teaching commitments and they do not want to read about all of the classes that you're teaching. Going back to that organization licensed IP, if you worked on, if as part of your research here at JMU, you developed some intellectual property, it is, you've gone through the IP disclosure form, JMU has appropriate ownership of the property, but it's going to be licensed to a startup that you are working in, that does not need to be disclosed. Startup packages that are from JMU as the proposing organization. So the fact that you're a new faculty member and they've given you so much travel funding a year does not need to be disclosed. This second to last one, honoraria or other gifts given for the purpose of conferring distinction or to symbolize respect, esteem, or admiration. Those do not have to be disclosed. They're sometimes difficult to distinguish between other things that do need to be disclosed. 3 flags for needs to be disclosed if, as part of that gift or recognition or honoraria, there's a co-authorship. So, you had to give some sort of paper and it's being put into an edited volume or something. If there's research oversight connected to it, so you're going to be participating in some sort of esteemed fellowship and you're going to be overseeing research, supervising students, guiding some sort of project. The last category is unrestricted gifts. There is a very particular definition of what an unrestricted gift is. And so if you think you have an unrestricted gift, do check that definition. Other things, training awards and prizes generally do not have to be disclosed. Again, I would check the definition carefully. Mentoring this part of an appointment or agreement or mentor-mentee relationships that don't involve your research activities. So if you have a faculty mentor that is mentoring you in your pedagogy, that doesn't need to be disclosed. They know JMU is paying you, and part of your pay is to go to research, that you are a faculty member at a research institution. They do not ask you to list your JMU pay on current pending other support. Core facilities and or shared equipment that is broadly available. So if your department has some sort of piece of equipment that's just open for everyone in the department to use, it's not particular to your research, you don't have to disclose it. And finally, indirect costs. So they know that indirect costs go back to the home organization, JMU, and that is used to support not just your research, but research across campus, keeping the lights on, keeping the trash cans empty. You don't have to list IDC and try and break down how much of it is coming back to support you specifically. Okay, so there was a lot of material there, and it's easy to get confused. I'll show you the NSF table that outlines this, but they also have an FAQ. I always like to point to this FAQ because there's some very important information on here, especially when it comes to effort, which is usually overlooked. And this is something that often causes some problems because the effort that they ask you to disclose on the current pending other support is not the funded effort. It's the actual expected effort. Okay. So since this is something that throws people for a loop, let me start by pointing to where that is in the FAQ. So the italics here are mine. Question 6, if the individual is not requesting salary support on the budget, does the proposal still need to be listed in the current pending other support? And the answer starts out very clear. Person month information, that's how we report effort, 1 person month, 2 person months, 0.5 person months, included in current pending other support may differ from the person months requested on the budget for a given project. For current and pending other support, senior personnel are required to provide the number of person months or partial person months per year to be devoted to the project by the individual. NSF uses the information provided in the current and pending other support to assess the capacity of the individual to carry out the research as proposed, as well as to help assess any potential overlap duplication with the project being proposed. And this sometimes causes some confusion if you've been around NSF grants for a while. And that's because the NSF generally has what's known as a 2-month rule, which is barring extenuating circumstances. Most of the time, the NSF is going to limit a PI to, across all their NSF grants, the total support can't add up to more than 2 months, because that's how much they think you really have in the summer. So they're basically like, we will chip in to pay you summer salary. They don't, unlike the NIH, they don't generally provide salary support during the year. And that is because they kind of look at this and say, well, as a researcher at a institution of higher education, you have research time, you have research expectations, and so you can take some of that research time that your employer is paying for and put it towards this project. And so people sometimes get confused because the NSF knows that in many cases, the research that you are doing is going to take more than 2 months, especially if you have more than one NSF grant. So that's question 7. The actual effort on a project will exceed the NSF's 2-month rule. How do we show this on future proposals without violating NSF policy? Again, they point back to if the individual will be spending time on the proposed project or award, then that time must be reported in current and pending other support. So it says at the beginning, the NSF is asking how much time the individual is planning to spend to complete the scope of work on the proposed project. The NSF is not asking for how much time is specified on the budget for a particular individual. So I kind of gave one example already where, someone might take 2 summer months, but then say, well, I'm also going to do 1 month of work over the course of the school year. And that tallies up to 3 months. And so in that case, you should put 3 months on your current pending other support, even though you only have 2 months of budget. Here's another case that we sometimes see, especially someone who has multiple grants. It's not that uncommon for grants to cover materials and supplies, equipment for a research project, but it doesn't cover salary support. Okay. However, he's doing this research as part of his employment duties during the academic year. The time he spends on this research project will total 1 month of full-time work. So in this case, Bob should report that $50,000 and 1 month of effort on his CPOS, even though there's no money for salary support in his grant. So it looks like I forgot the no there, but so that $50,000, he has to do that research project. Even though he's not getting funded for that 1 month of work, he has to do it to keep that $50,000 grant, so he's going to report that work even though it's not on a budget. In that FAQ, there's a lot of other really good questions in there, but in my experience, they provide to specific situations. So what if you have funding for a project that lasts more than 5 years? What do you do if you submit a CPOS form with a pending proposal and then you get good news that it's awarded? What do you do when you've submitted it and you forgot something? If you have a student or a trainee under you, do you have to include their research projects? Those are just a handful of the questions that are addressed in that FAQ. And again, I'll show you where to find it in a few minutes. Before we go to kind of the web portion of this and leave the slides behind, I want to say one final thing that is a change, okay? And that's this question of when should I prepare this? And we used to advise PIs to prepare the current pending other support right at the end. And the reason is that the current proposal, like the actual one that you are submitting, has to go on the current pending other support. So first of all, there always needs to be something on there, namely the one that you are submitting. But you can't really put that on until you know your budget, until your budget is completely final, because you have to give the dollar amount for this proposal. And so because of that, we used to recommend that people wait to do their current pending other support until after the budget is finalized and they have all that material. That is no longer our recommendation. We now say that you should start your CPOS form early and you should share it with your grant specialist, even if it's just a draft. And here's why. The NSF in July of last year put out this important security notice. And it says NSF proposers, that's JMU, and recipients, again, JMU when we get an award, are required to maintain supporting documentation, including copies of contracts, grants, or any other agreements, other information as reported in the current pending other support for all senior key personnel. And it has to be available to the NSF upon request. So the reason why we don't want you doing these last minute is that it takes a while to gather up that supporting documentation. Now, for proposals and awards that came through JMU, we can pull, or OSPS can pull the supporting documentation. They can pull up your proposal draft, they can pull up your award contract, and that's all stuff that we store. However, there are other things that you may have to disclose that are not awards or proposals that went through OSP, and we'll talk about that. If you are here for some other agency other than the NSF, that doesn't mean that you're off the hook here. So the NIH, for example, requires us to only collect contracts with foreign entities, but they actually have to be provided with the application. USDA is roughly similar to the NSF. Department of Energy is roughly similar to NIH. Okay, so this is the big change that happened last summer, these agencies putting those out. There are some rules for some other agencies as well. And so OSPAS cannot clear your proposal to go to submission until they have the necessary supporting documentation. And depending on the agency, they've reviewed it to make sure it matches what's in the current pending other support. So that's why we now recommend that you share a preliminary draft so that OSPAS can work with you to get and review this documentation, knowing that you're going to have to revise that last entry for the current proposal once you finalize the budget. And I do want to say that we do have a policy on this that is required by the NIH, that we have a written and enforced policy. So that's JMU Policy 2213, which basically outlines that we follow the regulations around current pending other support. OSPAS has an SOP that actually outlines in some detail what supporting documentation is required in most circumstances. Now, there are all sorts of crazy things that come through, so it's not going to cover everything. You may still need to ask or change what documentation. It also covers things like how that documentation is stored, what sort of security it has, and who has access to it, which is generally JMU's AORs, the people who can submit to it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go to the web-based resources, SciENcv, as well as those NSF resources, to get a little bit more of a hands-on building a current pending other support form. Okay, so here is the NSF page, the first one that I mentioned to you, that has the NSPM 33 disclosures. Okay, so you can see the URL at the top, but it's also easy to find on Google. Okay, so on this page, the most useful thing is this table, okay, and that has the type of activity and then where to put it on your proposal. So anything that is here tells you where it needs to go. So the first ones are in the biosketch, and then the very first thing that I listed straight from the NSPM 33, that very broad definition of support, you can see that that is here. Okay, and then here's some of the other information about the in-kind contributions. Here's that sponsored by foreign governments, instrumentalities, and entities, where it can go either the three places, consulting activities. Okay, so I think I pretty much covered most of these. This is post-award. There's a separate table for post-award situations. And at the end, this was the list of the activities that do not require disclosure. Unrestricted gifts. The definition here is down here. Okay, so this is kind of the key thing to refer to in terms of what needs to be disclosed and where. As I said, some of this seems contradictory, at least to me, so if you have questions, it's always useful to reach out to a program officer and then document their response. The FAQ that I talked about, okay, is here, okay, and here are the questions. So questions 6 and 7 are the ones that I already covered, but you can see there's a whole list of 20 questions here. You know, if we're a sub-awardee, are the overall objectives just ours or of the whole project, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten all of that out of the way, I'm sorry that was very long. Now let's get into the nuts and bolts. So if you brought your computer, please feel free to open up and go to SciENcv and log in. Okay, so here I am at my SciENcv homepage. You can see my name there, my title and department, et cetera, et cetera. How do we actually go about creating a current pending other support document? Okay, I see some folks still going to wait. Okay, hopefully you're logged in. If you're doing this at home, you can pause the video and get logged in until you see this page. Okay, what we're going to do is new document, okay, and you can give it a name. So I'm going to do CPOS example, okay, And then document type. And here you can see the list of the agencies that are currently using SciENcv. So Department of Energy, NIH, NSF, and USDA. Most other agencies like NASA will have something that looks very similar to this, but as an editable Word document instead of using SciENcv. Since this is the NSF Working Group, I'm going to scroll on down and do the NSF Current and Pending Other Support. Okay. Here you have a few options. You can use an existing document in SciENcv. So if you've made one of these before, you can just roll that information over. It is possible to keep all of your information in an XML file. That tends to be used at larger R1 institutions, especially medical schools, where there is a central office that has an XML file with all the information for everyone. What we're going to do today is this third option, start with a blank document, and hit create. And you can see that I have this document created. Asterisks, as always, indicate required sections or fields, and you want to look especially for anything that has a red circle next to it saying that it is not filled out and has to be. So this top one, note that your ORCID ID has to be on CPOS again. So if you haven't linked to that, you might want to refer back to our training from when we did bio sketches, okay? And then proposals and active projects. And again, there always needs to be one here, namely the one that you are actually proposing, that is this one's going with, okay? To add one, you can put one in here. So I'm just going to make one up. Example, it's pending. Current would be if you're actually getting money from it. Source of support, NSF. Primary place of employment, JMU. Start date, anticipated total amount, I'm going to say 250. I'll say it's going to start in December, and that it's going to go for, I don't know, 2 years. And then here, you always have to have the person months or partial person months devoted to the proposal or active project, and you have to cover all of the years. So we'll say that first year, 2026, it's starting in December, so maybe I'm going to put 0.5, 2027, maybe I'll have 1.2, and then in 2028, I'll say I have 1.2 again. Overall objectives, okay, so this is where you have to state your goal, so I don't know, I'm going to put understanding the universe. And then the statement of potential overlap. I always find that's a little bit silly for the one that I'm actually proposing. But especially for other sources of support, you definitely want to explain how you're not double dipping, but how hopefully it's complementary or has nothing to do with it. So I might just say, this is the entry for the current proposal that this form is attached to. Okay, and I'll go ahead and save that. Okay, and you can see that it goes here in this table. In-kind contributions, that is not required because you might or might not have in-kind contributions. It gives you a little bit of description here, similar to, or actually identical, hopefully, to what is on their table. And then the way that you get the document is by downloading the PDF. If there's something that's required that hasn't been completed, you won't be able to certify and download the PDF. I do want to flag that this certification has some important information there. So first of all, you're certifying that the information is current, accurate, and complete. You are also certifying that you are not party to a malign foreign talent recruitment program. If you have questions about that, ORIC is probably the best place to talk to. That's our Office of Research Integrity and Compliance. And then this last one, which is also relatively new, is that you have completed research security training. That can actually be done now direct on the NSF Secure website, or OSPAS actually has a module in Canvas you can do. Okay, so then you would just download PDF. If you want to see it beforehand, you would view the draft. And that is what there is to it. So the main complication is actually knowing what goes on there. If you have questions, we're always happy to help, but OSPAS are probably the main people to talk to, or ORIC. And again, your program officer is also someone if you've got I'm not sure whether to disclose or not. Okay, I will take some questions.